Morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Wake and J College Football Show. We're officially in the off season. We've been in the off season. Last two episodes I put out were recaps of the each conference, grading each team individually. But one thing we have not touched on so far is the transfer portal. So that's kind of what we're going to be touching on now. It's kind of hard to get into depth into the transfer portal just because we do have a second window coming up in April, I believe. So we're going to touch on it now, touch on it again in April once it closes, and kind of update it from there. But I'm not going to go too deep into the transfer portal. I did that last year, and I can honestly say it was probably the worst stretch of episodes that I put out. So if anybody did listen to those or take the time to listen to those, props to you. I'm sorry. You probably could have just skipped those, but this year we're trimming it down to just one episode, going through the transfer portal, just kind of touching on highlights, top players at positions, teams who won the transfer portal, although it's hard to say who wins until the season actually starts or is halfway through. Biggest losers of the transfer portal, again, it's hard to actually call them losers, but more or less getting into the teams that had the biggest amount of team or players leave their team. So brief overview, not going to get too in depth, not going to bore you with that, but it does need to be talked about. So we'll touch on it now, touch on it again in April, but yeah, that's what to expect for today, transfer portal. So let's get stoned and talk some football. All right, start our transfer portal talk. We'll just kind of, I'm going to run through each position group and just kind of give the top 5 players at each position. Now, this is all according to, depending on which site you use. I use 247. Maybe I should be using On3. I don't care. I've always liked 247, so I'm sticking with them for now. So that is who I use for my rankings. But yeah, we'll just start at quarterback. Now, this one's tough because quarterback, let's be honest, it's the most well-known position because there's only one quarterback on the field at a time. You could have multiple receivers, multiple running backs, multiple tight ends, multiple linemen on offense at least. And then on defense, multiples of every position as well. So quarterback's always going to be the most well-known just because there is one guy. So there's obviously going to be a ton of names in the top, like 25 QBs that entered the portal that you're probably going to recognize. Tough. I'm just going through the top 5 for now because, again, this is just a brief overview of the transfer portal. Can't get too in depth. Recruiting and transfer portal last year were my worst episodes. We could only do brief overviews of those this year, just to save you guys that pain. Top quarterback, Carson Beck. Originally, it seemed like he was going to enter the draft. Came back, got a big bag from Miami, transferring to Miami. John Mateer, for those who don't know, because technically this is not a Power 4 team, and I'm only going through Power 4 players, by the way. I'm not touching on any group of 5 transferring up, even if they are one of the top, transfer players. John Mateer played for Washington State. As you know, Washington State had a pretty good season, lost their offense coordinator to Oklahoma, their head coach to Wake Forest. Now they lost their quarterback also to Oklahoma. So I guess people weren't really shocked to see this one, but just after everything that happened. But John Mateer heading to Oklahoma, second-ranked quarterback in the transfer portal. Luke Kromenhoek, I don't know if I said that correctly, transferring from Florida State to Mississippi State. Tough to say because Mississippi State does need a quarterback. I think a lot of people thought maybe Jackson Arnold, who we're not going to talk about really, was going to go there. He didn't. Kromenhoek didn't necessarily look great at Florida State, but that's tough to say because Florida State was just a done team at that point. So we'll see how that goes, but he's the third-ranked quarterback. Fernando Mendoza, transferring from Cal to Indiana, and Malik Murphy heading from Duke to Oregon State. I'm shocked, actually, that Fernando Mendoza is ranked this high. Kind of shocked that Luke Kromenhoek is as well, but those are your top 5 quarterbacks and where they are currently headed now. Again, this is just the first round of the transfer portal. Things may change in the spring. Running backs, This one you do have a lot of group of 5 players who are ranked in the top 5, top 10. Again, I'm only touching on Power 4 and also the Pac 2. We got Justice Haynes moving from Bama to Michigan, which I think that's good for Michigan. They obviously like to run the ball, so they're going to always bring in running backs if they can. Wayshawn Parker, again, another offensive player leaving Wazoo. He's heading to Utah. You got Quentin Joyner heading to Texas Tech. Can't really blame him there, although Texas Tech, I guess they ran the ball quite a bit. You know what? That's a good choice by him, I feel like. C.J. Donaldson leaving West Virginia to head to Ohio State. And Dante Dowdle leaving Nebraska, heading to Kentucky. Here's something that you're going to see a lot of as we go through this. Nebraska. You're going to hear Nebraska's name a lot. They lost a lot of players, but they also brought in a lot of players. So you're going to hear Nebraska's name called a lot. I'm just going to say that. That's all. Wide receivers, we had Eric Singleton leaving Georgia Tech to head to Auburn. Zachariah Branch leaving USC for Georgia. Deuce Robinson also leaving USC for Florida State. USC losing Miller Moss, Quentin Joyner, Zachariah Branch, Deuce Robinson. Not great, guys. Not great. Dane Key leaving Kentucky for Nebraska. Again, there you go, another Nebraska. Nick Anderson leaving Oklahoma for LSU. Again, this is also another position that we probably could go pretty deep in, and you would still be recognizing names 25 in, 30 in, 40 in even, because there are so many receivers out there, and there are so many talented receivers. It's just, there's an influx at that position. These are the top 5, according to 247. I guess I could have gone through and picked out my top 5. There's just over 2,600 players entered the transfer portal this year. Obviously, that's not just Power 4, but man, that is a lot of players to try to look through and put your top 10. Now, obviously, you can narrow that down. I could have gone through and done my top 10. That's all I'm saying. I didn't. I am stealing from 247. Offensive line, you had, I'm probably going to butcher some of these names. Patrick Kudus leaving Arkansas, heading to Ole Miss. That's another thing you're going to notice. Not necessarily just hearing Ole Miss name, but, well, you're going to hear a lot of Ole Miss name, but it feels like a lot of Arkansas players left for Ole Miss. Maybe it's just 2. It just feels like a lot. I just feel like I kept seeing that tie-in often. You got Emmanuel Pregnon leaving USC, heading to Oregon. Fa'amo leaving Wazoo for Wake Forest. Another player leaving Wazoo on the offensive side, following his head coach to Wake Forest. Xavier Chaplin leaving Virginia Tech for Auburn. And Elijah Pritchett leaving Bama for Nebraska. There's Nebraska again. Like I said, lost a lot of players, lost a lot of talent. Also brought in some guys. Tight end group, you had Max Clare leaving Purdue for Ohio State. Luke Haas leaving Arkansas for Ole Miss. Jaden Platt leaving A&M for Arkansas. Jamari Johnson leaving Louisville for Oregon. And Bauer Sharp leaving Oklahoma for LSU. Honestly, that's another team you're going to hear a lot of is LSU. We'll get into the top 10 transfer classes as of right now, but spoiler, LSU is in the top 10. Defensive line / edge, and defensive line in general. You had Patrick Payton moving from Florida State to LSU. Damon Wilson, I think the second or the third. I forgot to put down his prefix or suffix or whatever the fuck you call that. Heading from Georgia to Mizzou, which kills me. I hate to see Mizzou getting any good players. If you've listened to any episodes, you know I don't like Mizzou. Princewell Umanuelin, I nailed it. Nebraska to Ole Miss. Again, there's Nebraska being mentioned. Jaheim Otis moving from Bama to Colorado. And then Williams Nwaneri leaving Mizzou for Nebraska. Again, Nebraska being mentioned. That's 2 players so far that are in the top 5 that have gone to Nebraska, and we're about to mention another one. Deshaun McCullough leaving Oklahoma for Nebraska. Guys, Nebraska, they might be a force to be reckoned with next year. And that hurts me to say because as a Minnesota fan, I just don't like Nebraska. Nakai Hill Green, moving from Colorado to Alabama. Kamori House, following his defensive coordinator from Washington to UNC, playing for Bill Belichick now. Kendall Daniels, Oklahoma State to Oklahoma. And again, Nebraska being mentioned. Mekhi Gabayer, moving from Nebraska to motherfucking Mizzou. Nebraska, just wild. So much talent leaving, but also just so much coming back or coming in. All right, defensive backs. This is the last position group we're going through, obviously. I know this is rough to listen to, so I appreciate you if you've gotten this far. But we got Takario Davis following his previous head coach, Jed Fish. He's heading from Arizona to Washington. Xavier Lucas. We got to actually probably talk on this story at some point. I guess we'll leave that for an off-season day, but we're in the off-season. You know what I mean. In the future here, because let's be honest, not a lot of episodes coming up after this. Xavier Lucas, moving from Wisconsin to Miami. A lot of weird stuff going on at Wisconsin. And that makes me happy, obviously, as a Minnesota fan. But this is Xavier, however you pronounce it. I've been yelled at for both. It's a weird story. He's claiming that Wisconsin's not allowing him to enter the transfer portal, and he's, I think, wanting to sue or has sued. It's a whole ordeal. But anyways, he is heading to Miami. We got Mansour Delane heading from Virginia Tech to LSU. I told you, LSU had a good transfer class. Julian Humphrey from Georgia to A&M, and Brandon Sissy from NC State to South Carolina. I also wanted to touch on top, 6. I just went through the top teams that lost the most players to the transfer portal. There's a lot of teams that tied, so I just kind of handpicked a few. And it's hard to call some of these teams losers just because there's a reason all these players entered the transfer portal. But at the top of this list is Purdue. And again, hard to call them easy to call them a loser. You're a 1-11 team, but they lost 32 players to the transfer portal, and maybe calling them a loser for losing 32 players to the portal is not the correct term. But one, they lost their head coach, and that's always going to happen. You lose your head coach, you're going to have a wave hit the portal. But two, you were a 1-11 team. So everything that was there clearly wasn't that great. Now, some of it's coaching and play calling and whatnot, but you had the talent that was there was 1-11. So when I see people on Twitter saying, well, Purdue needs to keep Dylan Thieneman or Yanni Karloftis or whatnot, do they though? Because they were part of a 1-11 team. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're going to go off and do great things at a better school, which is quite possible. But at the same time, Purdue losing 32 players, it's probably good for Purdue to be losing that many players because they weren't good to begin with. People thought it was harsh when Deion Sanders marched into Colorado and just said, you guys aren't good, get out. The only difference between what Deion did and what other coaches do is Deion just put it out there for everybody to see. But let's be honest. You're a 1-11 team. It's hard to call you a loser for losing 32 players because you probably needed to get rid of most of those 32 players. And Purdue's bringing in quite a few people. So hard to call them a loser because you needed to get rid of you needed to trim the fat there. Their biggest loss, I guess we could say, is Dylan Thieneman. If we were trying to broaden it to a position group, defensive back or D-line. But again, hard to say that anything is necessarily the biggest loss because you were a 1-11 team. You needed to upgrade at every position anyways. Next on this list is Arkansas. 30 players in the portal, which is kind of, not shocking because you were a 6-6, 7-6 team, whatever it was. But you weren't a good team. You did just enough to keep Sam Pittman. Maybe some of the players were banking on Sam Pittman being fired, and he wasn't. So they're like, all right, I'm out. But yeah, 30 players to hit the portal. Biggest loss, position group wise at least, I would probably say offensive line. You lost 4 of them to the portal. I think at least 2 of them were starters, if not more. But yeah, going into next year, if they weren't going to be starters, that's still depth at a very important position. Because let's be honest, guys, there's always injuries. Offensive linemen, you need to have an influx. Look at Ohio State. They lost their 2 best offensive linemen, but they had guys that could step up. Tough to lose offensive linemen, especially 4 of them, when they could have been starters, when some of them were starters. Arizona, 30 players in the portal, and honestly, are we really shocked? I didn't think Arizona was going to be good to begin with. Turns out I was right. Bad teams tend to lose the most players to the portal. And teams that lose their coach, which is usually because you guys are bad. Biggest loss, they lose 5 defensive backs to the portal. That's quite a few. So you're going to have watch out for Arizona's secondary to not be the greatest next year. Depends on who they officially bring in. We'll check in after spring transfer portal. Nebraska, again, this is a team we were going to mention a lot. I told you, 27 players in the portal. Biggest loss, easily defensive line. 7 of them in the portal. And you got guys that are just not coming back because they're graduating or headed to the draft. That's a lot to be losing. Because again, defensive line and offensive line, you need a lot of depth. Defensive line, you're rotating guys in. Or I guess a lot of teams are rotating guys in. Offensive line, you just need depth because there's injuries. And defensive line too. So even if all 7 of these guys aren't starters, that's still depth and competition at a position that you need competition and depth. Tough loss. Oklahoma, again, not shocking. I guess the most shocking team on this list is Nebraska losing 27 players because, yes, they weren't a great team, but it feels like they're on the up and up, and I know they lost their defensive line coach and their defensive coordinator, so I get that, so that's also a huge reason, but they are probably the most shocking team on this list. Oklahoma lost 26 players. And again, this is going to be similar to Purdue, but Oklahoma was a little different. Biggest loss is wide receiver. Now, some would argue, is it really a loss because the wide receiver sucked this year? But I don't know if it's necessarily the wide receiver sucked or all your best ones were hurt. You didn't really have receivers to throw to because so many were injured. At least at the beginning of the year. So I guess you could argue both sides of that, but 6 receivers in the portal is still not great, regardless of anything like that. Now, some would argue if you were to look at their biggest individual loss, I'm sure there's some people who would argue that Jackson Arnold leaving Oklahoma might be the biggest loss, just because I think there's people who still have think there's a high upside there with Arnold. So depending on how the rest of his college career goes, that could be their biggest loss looking back. But for a position group as a whole, it's definitely receivers because you are losing 6 of them. And then, this is not really a shock again because it's a bad team, but Mississippi State losing 26 players to the portal. Biggest loss, you could argue there isn't one for position group wise. If we went individual, probably Kevin Coleman, because as bad as you were this year, Kevin Coleman was nearly a 1,000-yard receiver. Maybe Michael Van Buren, because he was a baller as I believe, true freshman. But he hit the portal. But you're a 2-10 team. Similar to Purdue, it's hard to say that anything losing your team is a big loss because you guys were so bad, you need to trim the fat. Now we got to talk about teams that won the transfer portal. And again, it's hard to say that a team necessarily wins or loses the transfer portal until the season is, I guess you could even argue, halfway done at least. Just because you don't know how these guys are going to mesh. Sometimes it takes a transfer a year or two to really get into the offense. Like look at most transfer quarterbacks. that have 2 years of eligibility remaining. Look at their first year with the team and look at their second year with the team. That second year, and also we're talking that there's no coaching changes and anything like that. Offensive coordinator's different, but when a quarterback has that second year in a system after transferring there, it's almost always better. Joe Burrow is the greatest example of that. He transfers to LSU with 2 years remaining. That first year, it was fine. It got better as the year went on. You could see it starting to click. And then he has that full off season with all of his guys. Goes into next year after having played one full season and a full off season, and they put on the greatest performance of all time. That's obviously the greatest example. But it can take a player a couple years to finally, show something. So it's hard to say that these teams necessarily won, but these are the top 10 teams based on the rankings of the recruits that they brought in. We got LSU at number 1. I'll just run through the top 10 quick, and then I'll kind of go through the top 3 players that each team brought in. You got LSU at 1, Ole Miss 2, Texas Tech 3, Auburn 4, Miami 5, Kentucky 6. Shocker. Florida State 7, Texas A&M 8, Nebraska again 9, and Mizzou 10. So you'll notice that Nebraska is on both winner and loser because and sorry, I don't want to call them losers because you're just losing a lot of players. But Nebraska lost a lot of players, but like I told you earlier, they're bringing a lot in. I think the most shocking team on this list is probably, I want to say Texas Tech, but I feel like they've got a good NIL fund going. It's Kentucky, in my opinion. I didn't expect Kentucky to have a top 10 transfer class. LSU bringing in edge rusher Patrick Payton from Florida State, wide receiver Nick Anderson from Oklahoma, and wide receiver Berrien Brown from Kentucky. I think Kentucky probably could have been added to the biggest loser list just because they did lose quite a bit of talent. But they're also bringing in quite a bit, just like Nebraska. Ole Miss is bringing in edge Princewell Umanmielen from Nebraska, offensive lineman Patrick Kudis from Arkansas, and tight end Luke Haas from Arkansas. Texas Tech bringing in interior offensive lineman, and I know I'm just going through the top 3 recruits that they're bringing in. Some of these guys are group of 4 or group of 5 or even FCS. But that's fine. We're not getting too deep into them. Offensive lineman Hunter Zambrano from Illinois State, edge rusher Romello Height from Georgia Tech, and defensive lineman Lee Hunter from UCF. Auburn is bringing in wide receiver Eric Singleton, offensive tackle Xavier Chaplin from Virginia Tech, and wide receiver Horatio Fields from Wake Forest. Really loading up on that offense there, which struggled so much this last year. Miami, Carson Beck. Bringing in cornerback Xavier Lucas, and then defensive lineman David Blay from Louisiana Tech. Kentucky, you have them bringing in defensive lineman David Augusta from Wazoo, Alex Wolschlager from Bowling Green, and edge rusher Cameron Olds from Kent State. This is also why I'm shocked that Kentucky's in the top 10, because their best transfer they're bringing in is a defensive lineman from Washington State. Shocking right there. Their next best is an offensive tackle from Bowling Green in the MAC. I guess I can't argue with that. The MAC is Big Ten Junior, so they're going to have good offensive linemen, I guess. And then you got edge rusher Cameron Olds from Kent State. I don't know if you guys know anything about Kent State because I didn't really touch on Group of 5 this year. Purdue had a bad season. Florida State had a bad season. Mississippi State had a bad season. Kent State had one of the worst seasons of all time. Just a pitiful team. And the fact that they have somebody who is somebody's top 3 recruit, a Power 4 team's top 3 transfer recruit coming in, is just shocking to me. Florida State bringing in wide receiver Deuce Robinson, edge rusher James Williams from Nebraska, and interior offensive lineman Luke Pettibon from Wake Forest. Texas A&M, the 8th best class, bringing in wide receiver Casey Concepcion, I don't know, From NC State, wide receiver Micah Hudson from Texas Tech, and wide receiver Mario Craver from Mississippi State. We can see where Texas A&M's head is at. Their passing attack was terrible this last year, so they are going heavy into the receivers. And then here we go, Nebraska, number 9. Wide receiver Dane Key from Kentucky, edge rusher Williams Nwaneri from Mizzou, and offensive tackle Elijah Pritchett from Bama. Nebraska lost a lot, but they're bringing in a lot of talent. So Nebraska could be good this year, and that hurts. I've said it already, but it hurts me to say that. And then my least favorite team, Mizzou, rounding out the top 10. Edge rusher Damon Wilson from Georgia, Kevin Coleman, wide receiver from Mississippi State, and then running back Ahmad Hardy from University of Louisiana Monroe. So yeah, as of right now, those are your top 10 teams in the transfer portal. Again, there's going to be another window opening up in the spring. And let's be honest, there's still some guys right now who still don't have a home, and we'll probably find one here in the next month or two. So it's going to happen. We'll touch on it again. This top 10 is going to change. And when it does, we'll just kind of update everything and kind of go from there. Last thing I want to touch on before I sign off, Minnesota Minute. Minnesota has the 27th ranked transfer class. Not too high, but I love their transfer class. I like where their head was at. I liked where they put all their focus at. Because when you look at this team, they lost more on the offense than they did on the defense. That's including transfers, that's draft, that's everything. They lost a lot more on offense than they did defense. And when you look at the positions that they targeted, it's where they lost the most. They brought in 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 3 linemen, a tight end, 2 defensive linemen, a linebacker, and a defensive back. I love it. I really do, because you're losing a lot of offensive linemen, so you need to bring in some depth. Now, are all 3 linemen going to be starters? Probably not, but you need that depth. You need that competition. You're losing Daniel Jackson. You're losing Elijah Spencer. You're losing a couple guys to the portal. You have to bring in some wide receivers to compete, and they did that. You're losing Marcus Majors. You're losing a couple guys to the transfer portal. You still have Darius Taylor. You still have a couple guys on the roster, but you needed something. So you go out and get a couple running backs. And then you got a redshirt freshman quarterback who is probably going to be the starter, who's had a year to work under one of the smartest quarterbacks to ever put on the Gopher uniform, if not the smartest, Max Brosmer. Also has had a year to learn the offense, because your offense coordinator is the same, Greg Harbaugh. But you need to challenge him with a guy with some experience. You have to. Rising tide floats all boats. Or rises all boats, raises all boats. However that term goes, you need to bring in competition. I love it. I do. Now, do I think Zach Pyron is necessarily the best quarterback they could have gotten? No. Do I think Zach Pyron is still going to see playing time even if Lindsey is the starter? Yes. He is athletic. He can use his legs. I didn't love the pickup. I think they could have done better at quarterback, but not the worst guy to bring in. And again, he's still going to be useful even if he's not the starter. And again, you really didn't need to bring in too many defensive players, because I feel like the Gophers like the depth that they already have. Plus, you didn't lose a ton to the portal. Some to the draft, but not a ton to the portal. Top 3 recruits that they did bring in: wide receiver Malachi Coleman from Nebraska, running back A.J. Turner from Marshall, and offensive lineman Marcellus Marshall from UCF. I would say the biggest individual loss that they had, was Phillip Daniels, their right tackle heading to Ohio State. Other than losing him, though, I wasn't really upset by what the Gophers lost. Sure, you lose Bangura and Newbin. Not going to miss them too much. They didn't contribute much anyways. You lost Hoskins and McWilliams, again, guys that weren't contributing that much. You do lose a lot of offensive line just to the draft in general, but losing Phillip Daniels to Ohio State definitely hurt the most. But all in all, I love I love what the Gophers are doing so far this offseason. You're not losing too many guys. Like I said, Phillip Daniels is the one that I'm like, that sucked. but you're bringing in a lot of competition, a lot of talent, and I like where they are headed. But yeah, that's my transfer portal talk. Again, like I've been saying over and over again, we'll touch on it again in the spring. From here on out, I don't know how many episodes there's going to be. It's definitely not going to be every week, but there will be some throughout the off season until we start going full steam ahead again in, well, I guess probably end of May, middle of June, somewhere in that span is probably when we'll start going full steam ahead again. But I thank y'all for joining me this season. If you continue to join me throughout the off season, that's awesome. If not, I completely understand. It's not the most fun college football podcast to listen to when there's just no college football going on. But thank y'all for joining me. I will talk to you again when I see fit.